Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's a joy to be back here, especially with one of my favorite people and closest friends. I guess may as well let the cat out of the bag. When Henry Fortunato of the library first proposed this series to me, I immediately recognized it as a chance to get my friends to come to Kansas City, and that's my ulterior motive here, but I think you'll be glad that I did. Before we get started, I do want to introduce a distinguished guest in our audience tonight. I'm not sure everyone in Kansas City understands that right now on the distant red planet, this fabulous rover that's bringing back all this fascinating scientific information was actually named by a resident of our fair metropolis. And she's with us here tonight, Shawnee Mission East student Clara Maw. Clara, where are you? Stand up, stand up.
Stand up. All right, Clara.
Yes. She's on the East Robotics team with my son, Henry, and I'm hoping some of that will rub off on him. We can dream. Tonight, Joel Achenbach. Years ago, when I was drummed out of academia, Crosby left that part out. I was awarded a master's degree in literature on the condition that I stop studying literature. There was this requirement, and I needed a job, and so the only thing I knew how to do was journalism, which doesn't, as you know, doesn't require any special skills. And I got a job at a place where a lot of young people were going in those days, the Miami Herald. I was very lucky to get there. And there was, I won't
Hold on a second.
get too boring about this.
Is this going to be the life story of David Von
Yes, the life story of David Von Dreher.
Is anyone else having that question in
When I got there were a lot of talented young people there, but there was this cult around one young reporter who drove a car that would not turn right. So he would arrive at places by going around the block, a series of left turns. But he was so talented that literally the editors in the room would not speak to each other because they were fighting over him and his time. And this proved to be Joel Achenbach. I was in awe of him from the start. Although as I came to know him, that awe was tempered by a realization that we shared a deep social misfit streak, I would say.
Yeah, he's still in awe.
Yeah, I am.
I think you can sense it.
I'm still in awe.
You?
At any rate,
you can feel it in the room, the awe.
we reconnected at the Washington Post, where he was and continues to be that rarest of Washington journalists.
Employed.
I won't even finish that sentence. He is a child of the 60s, and children of the 60s dreamed of human beings traveling in space, boldly going where no one had gone before. He's been chronicling that dream now for 30 years, and he's here to report on the state of that dream. His excellent piece ran on the front page of the Washington Post this weekend. Joel, tell us what's going on at NASA.
Okay, just the child of the 60s thing, I'm not high right now. Just to make that clear. However, I'm going to tell you what NASA's up to, and you may wonder if the people at NASA are high. So the basic problem, and I think what we're going to talk about with space travel, the basic problem is that the thing that everyone wants to do is very hard to do, and that's to go to Mars. I mean, it'd be really neat to have a human being, a geologist, a scientist, or a team of them on Mars to figure out what happened to that planet. It's a dead planet as far as we can tell. There might be some vestigial life on it, but we think that there was life 3 billion years ago, and there's not anymore. It'd be nice to have people on Mars to dig around. Now, right now, we have this rover, Curiosity, that is probing and trying to find out some of these secrets. But you have to operate the rover from Earth, and there's a huge time delay to try to operate a rover. It's essentially a fairly sluggish operation. It'd be great to have a human being with hands, or gloves, whatever, to say, let's turn over that rock, let's dig there, let's go deeper. So that would be a great goal, and I think everyone in the space program would like to do that. The problem is that Mars is very far away. All objects in the solar system are all moving. It's not like it's parked there waiting for us to go to it and come back. It's moving too. Any trip to Mars takes at least 2 years. We've never had a trip like that in the space program. And although you can come up with designs for doing it, and I think that later this year we'll hear some more suggestions for how you might do it. Under today's budgets, under today's fiscal realities, we're not going to be able to go to Mars with a government agency paying the freight. It's too far, too difficult, too costly. So what's the fallback position? The fallback position, according to our national space policy of 2010, is to go to an asteroid by 2025. President Obama said in a speech in April 15th, 2010, down at the Kennedy Space Center, he said, we're going to send humans for the first time to an asteroid by 2025. Then we'll send them in orbit around Mars in the 2030s with, at some point, a landing to follow. Now, the idea is going to an asteroid is easier than going to Mars. But here's the problem. It's still too hard. And I did not know this until I started reporting my story. I always think, well, which asteroid would they go to, and where is this asteroid? Well, again, these things are all moving. It's not so much the where, it's well, how fast is it moving? What's the trajectory you're going to take to get there? Engineers talk about delta V, the change in velocity. There's any trip to an asteroid, even one that comes kind of close to the Earth, that trip, round trip, is going to take a year. Now, does NASA have a spaceship that can go orbit the sun, tracking an asteroid and come back to Earth? No, it doesn't have that. They do, however, have a lot of hardware they're building. This is going to get a little complicated here, but I'm going to power through.
We're with you so far.
Okay, so
asteroid.
All right, so you can't. So Obama says we're going to go to an asteroid.
What happened to the moon? Last time I checked in, we were going back to the moon.
So the problem with the moon is that we've already done that.
Been there, done that.
And that's a pretty compelling problem.
We didn't find much there.
Well, I mean, it wasn't horrible.
No.
I mean,
it was paradise compared to Mars or an asteroid.
The moon has certain advantages. First of all, it's only 3.5 days away. You can go there and come back in a week. I mean, it's really not very far away. So President Bush, in fact, said, we're going to go back to the moon. He said we were going to have a whole new program. It's going to be called Constellation. Constellation is going to have a new rocket that'll take astronauts to orbit, a new heavy lift rocket that would take astronauts to the vicinity of the moon, a new capsule called Orion, which will go on top of this rocket, and the astronauts will ride in this capsule, and the new lunar lander called Altair, which will go down to the moon. And then we'll have a sustained human presence on the moon that'll get us more comfortable with sort of living off the planet. And eventually then we'll go to Mars. There's always this sort of and then we'll go to Mars. It's always easy to sort of tack that on, okay? So the problem with that is that when Obama became president, he said, I don't want to go back to the moon, okay, essentially. And he had political appointees who said, if you want to go to Mars, going to the moon is sidetracking you, literally. And moreover, Obama appointed a panel of people led by a very distinguished former aerospace executive named Norman Augustine, who looked at the Constellation program and said, it doesn't make sense. The timelines don't make sense. The budgets don't make sense. There's no money for this. At the rate you're going, you're not going to get anywhere near the moon until the late 2020s, and you have no money left for a lander. So all you're going to be able to do is sort of circle the moon. And so they said, let's change our whole strategy and look at something called the flexible path. And Obama has adopted the flexible path approach. And it's not a bad idea. The idea is, let's focus on investing in new technology, investing in new ways to do things, new propulsion mechanisms. Let's invest in some things that'll help us get to Mars someday. And let's not focus on like going back to the moon. Well, meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, the Congress decides, yeah, but we kind of liked all this money we were giving to some of our favorite congressional districts to build some of this hardware to go back to the moon. So they're still building the heavy lift rocket that can get you near the moon. And they're still building the Orion space capsule that will go on top of that rocket. And this raises an obvious question.
What are they going to do with that?
Yeah, what are they going to do with that? Okay, so now you're building a rocket. It's going to cost some billions of dollars. You're building a space capsule. Again, billions of dollars. What are you going to do with this? You're not going to go up to the space station because it's in low Earth orbit, and this stuff is way overbuilt for that. The capsule is overbuilt for that. The rocket is a heavy lift rocket. It's designed to go to the moon. They're not building a lander, so they have to go somewhere with it. And that brings me finally to, the asteroid redirect mission, which is what I wrote about in our story that ran Sunday in the Washington Post. And I encourage you.
The asteroid redirect mission.
It was originally called the asteroid retrieval mission, but I guess they thought that sounded silly. So the asteroid, there is a lot to be said positively about the idea. It actually does bring together a lot of things that NASA wanted to do. So here's what's good about the asteroid redirect mission. First of all, the idea is you'd send out a robotic spacecraft that would extrude this sort of tent-like moon bounce contraption that would swallow a rock, a small asteroid. Then, using a new propulsion mechanism, would bring it back to the moon and go into a high retrograde orbit around the moon, which is about 40,000 miles above the moon. It goes around the moon. Then you would launch in your new heavy lift rocket, in your new capsule, 2 astronauts. They'd fly to the moon, or near the moon. They'd go into orbit around the moon. They would dock with the robotic spacecraft that has the bagged rock on the end. They would then open up the capsule. Unfortunately, they forgot to build an airlock, but they can bring along extra canisters of breathable air and then open up the capsule to space, just the way they did back during the Gemini program in the 1960s. And the 2 astronauts aboard, and Orion's built for 4, but you could only bring 2 astronauts on this mission because the capsule's filled with tanks of breathable air. So the 2 astronauts aboard, hopefully they've already put on their spacesuits by now because the hatch is open. They would climb out of the capsule and they would climb along a rail or whatever and eventually come up to this bag inside of which is a rock, and they would then encounter the asteroid and do whatever that involves, whatever people do when they encounter a rock. You chip at it, you write your initials in it, I guess.
I want to say
Kilroy was here. I don't know what you do. And then they would take samples back, and they'd fly back to Earth and splash down in the ocean, and that would be the asteroid redirect mission.
I want to say 2 things about that. Number 1, it sounds absolutely insane. And number 2, it sounds really cool. I mean, I've thought about it all day since I read your story, thought about it after hearing you talk about it on the radio this morning. And the more I hear it, crazy as it is, the more I like it. I mean, can you imagine grabbing an asteroid, And obviously you can imagine it, you just described it.
We have
What is the chance
never
of
redirected a natural
asteroid
object from its natural orbit. We've never done anything like it. It would be, I mean, we should say up front, it's not going to happen. But, and people may watch this, on the internet, and I should make clear that, it could happen under certain timelines. It could happen under certain budgets. We call this story, and you can Google this phrase, NASA's Mission Improbable, because under the projected timeline that when they announced this, they said that this would happen ideally in 2021 on the very first mission of the very first crewed mission of the Orion space capsule. The people who run the human spaceflight program don't want to do something this elaborate on their first crewed mission. Their first mission with people on it, they would prefer something a little simpler and safer. I mean, if they're going to go fly to the moon, and go in orbit around the moon and come back home, arguably on your first flight with new hardware, that's enough, without then doing spacewalks and doing something in this bag with the asteroid inside. The other problem with the program is that the rock that they're going to grab and capture, they don't have a rock.
They
haven't found that rock. So for it to work, you have to understand. So you have a robotic spacecraft goes out. Here's an asteroid coming along. What do asteroids do? As you know, asteroids spin and they tumble. So it can't be spinning too much, and it can't be tumbling too much. These are two totally different things. Okay. Maybe it's not spinning very much, but it's tumbling a lot, okay? It can't have too many axes of rotation. It can't be too big or too small. I mean, one concern, which we mentioned, is that when you see a little streak of light in a telescope, you can't tell how big it is. You can't tell how big that object is. It's just, you get a few pixels of data. What is that thing? Some of these things may not even be asteroids. They could be rocket boosters that have been left in space from other space missions. And so the worst thing that could happen is they do all this foo-for-ah and they send this robotic mission out there with the big bag comes out and it grabs something that has Russian writing on it. You don't want that. And actually the thing that I think would even be worse is they've talked about, okay, so let's say we can't find the right rock. It's going too fast. It's tumbling. It's too crumbly. It's just a bag of stones, or it's like a sandbar in space. We'll go to Plan B. We'll go and we'll just break a boulder off a known asteroid. Asteroid, we know where it is. We know how big it is. It's a big old thing. We'll go break off a boulder and bring that back. But what worries me about that, and I think what worries some of them, is that you may wind up with a rock that it's just kind of underwhelming. Okay, it may only be about the size of this chair, that I'm sitting in, and so you've got all this elaborate stuff going on to encounter. It's this little rock, and it's like, and I don't know if you know the movie This Is Spinal Tap, where the Stonehenge comes down and it's too small, So there's the old, This Is Spinal Tap problem. Obama said we will send humans to an asteroid, okay? Ideally, he was thinking of something more than we're going to send humans to something the size of a hassock, Do people know what a hassock is?
No,
that's a word, right? I mean, I didn't.
But it's always preceded by the word grandmas. Yes, when I hear the president say humans to an asteroid, I think of something they could, for example, stand on.
Yeah, or blow up.
Blow up. Right?
I mean, I've thought all along.
That actually takes me to my next question, which is, obviously, the reason that we would start with a small asteroid is because all this technology would help to save us in case a large asteroid is found coming to destroy Earth and extinguish us like the dinosaurs, right?
Okay, so this was heavily marketed earlier in the summer as planetary defense, i.e., if you could move this rock, maybe you can keep a big old rock from hitting the Earth. The problem with that is that it's not true. Because
Houston, we need a bigger bag.
the kind of there are reasons for doing this mission that would be helpful long term for example, a Mars mission. But you probably would not use any of this kind of architecture, as they say, to move a rock that's going to hit the Earth. Okay, because first of all, the rocks that you could bag are going to be in the order of the size, maybe 20 to 30 feet across. That's the size, roughly, actually a little bit smaller than the rock that exploded over Russia earlier this year, quite spectacularly. No one got killed by that. Those size rocks aren't planet killers. You don't need to deflect a rock that size. You need to deflect a rock that's closer to a mile across, not 30 feet. And you would not use any of this kind of a system to do that. You would probably use something a little more like a video game where you use some kind of kinetic force to blast the rock. So if it's planetary defense you want to do, I don't think you would do any of these things. At the root of this asteroid redirect mission is the fact that it gives you a place to go with the new rocket and the new spaceship. It also, so you could say cynically, it's kind of a made-up destination in a way to create some political cover for these very expensive pieces of hardware that have stakeholders out there who want to keep building this stuff, and they don't want to have to answer the question, where is it going to go? They could say, well, it's going to go save the Earth by deflecting an asteroid. But the argument in favor of the new rocket and the new space capsule is you need stuff like this to go to Mars someday. So if you're going to go to Mars someday, you're going to have to start taking some steps. And so maybe this is not the perfect mission. Maybe going out to the moon and encountering an asteroid, or more likely, going out to the moon, going around the moon and coming home, is a little underwhelming. But if we're ever going to do this human mission to Mars, we got to start taking steps to go beyond low Earth orbit. And I'm sympathetic to that argument if Mars is the goal. But if Mars is the goal, you might want to put together a Mars program in which everything you do helps you get to Mars, and you're not doing any shenanigans along the way, okay? Because the money is tight, and you want to keep your eyes on the prize.
Now, years ago, when I was in the early years of my Achenbach worship, you wrote a piece that was very formative of my thinking about space, in which, as I recall, you basically laid out two essential problems facing human exploration, physical exploration, and we'll come to the robots later, of space. One of them was speeds and distances, right? Things are simply too far apart. And the second was that space is a really nasty place for human beings to spend any time. Cosmic rays and all sorts of stuff. You wrote in your book, Captured by Aliens, available on Amazon, which, despite the title, is highly scientific. Really wonderful read about all the subjects we're talking about here, and this compelling desire that we have to think about this idea of traveling through space. You wrote about some of the ideas coming out of JPL and some of the other really big thinkers about how we might conquer one or both of these issues, that things are too far and that space is too hostile. Talk a little about that and tell us, are those things real? Are scientists making theoretical progress on either one, speeding us up or making us more robust for space?
Well, speed is not the only virtue. Another thing is sort of energy efficiency. So one of the nice things about this asteroid redirect mission is it uses something called solar electric propulsion, which this robotic spacecraft, essentially it's a solar array. It doesn't go fast so much as it's very efficient. You don't have to use lots of chemical propellants to get someplace. And so there's a lot of different ways to do space travel. It is unfortunate the solar system was designed the way it was, because it really there should be someplace easier to go past the moon other than Mars. As you said in your intro, I mean, I've always assumed that we were going to be part of this expanding civilization and expanding into space. That space was where our destiny would be found in a certain way. And I don't know if I really believe that the way I did as a kid. I do think it's possible. I think it's challenging, though. You know, when you look at Star Trek and they're zooming all over the galaxy and there's warp 8 and all that, it seems like that Einstein's rules on the speed of light as the ultimate cosmic speed limit have withstood many assaults in recent years. Last year, there was a story we ran saying, there are neutrinos that are going faster than the speed of light, and Einstein was wrong. No, Einstein was right. Our story was essentially
wrong.
Who
are you going to believe?
Yeah, who are you going to believe?
Who are you going to believe?
Good rule is stick with Einstein on this stuff. So it's very far to the nearest star. It's very far even to Mars. That said, you're always making a mistake if you predict anything more than about 5 years in the future. I mean, there's so much of our lives today, we could not have imagined, even when like you were a kid back in the 40s.
Right.
Sorry, I don't know. Cheap shot. So. But I mean, a lot of what we see today feels like magic. So, and Mars has as much land as the Earth. It's very far away, but it is sort of the doable mission you could imagine out there. So, could they do it? I don't see how the United States government is going to be able to do it in the near future, because it would cost a lot of money. Governments are also risk averse. One of the problems with NASA is it can't kill the astronauts, okay? And if you're in the private sector, an entrepreneur, you can come up with plans that, we're going to send a fleet of rockets there, and we're going to have a colony with 80,000 people, and it's a lot of that stuff is just not very plausible. NASA wants to actually land astronauts safely and bring them back to Earth. That costs more. Okay, if they stay alive, that costs extra, so the Curiosity rover that we mentioned earlier was a 1-ton payload, so it's a big object. But to put humans on Mars, that's 40 tons, and that's really a whole different technology to land something that heavy. Now you'd say, well, I said to the experts at NASA, why not land the fuel and the food and the astronauts and the Starbucks all separately in four separate payloads, right? And he made the point that it's kind of hard to pinpoint your landing spot, and so you can just imagine that, you land on Mars, where's our food?
Where's the food?
Yeah, it's the other side of that mountain. Okay, it's like and so the Mars rover lands, and it used in part a parachute. It used several different mechanisms. Thrusters, it used an aero brake where it comes in and just uses the thin atmosphere a little bit. So you think, well, why not use a bigger parachute? You'd need a parachute the size of the Rose Bowl, okay? Now, fold that up, okay, and put that inside of a spacecraft and let it unfurl, nicely in a place that has essentially almost no atmosphere. That's not going to work. I mean, just the physics there are very challenging. So I can't remember what the question was. I forgot.
I remember you talking about ships powered by light itself with sails that would be propelled by light rays, and talking about space elevators and some ideas that are feel more sort of futuristic than simply a larger Roman candle than the one we have right now. How's that coming along?
How's that coming along? The space elevator?
Yeah.
Well, the nice thing about the space elevator, as I understand it, is that you could essentially, if you could create a very long cable from the ground up to about 22,000 miles above the surface, you could things would just sort of, by centrifugal force, ride up the cable into space. The problem with that is, someone cuts the cable and then it's a big mess.
And you're gone.
It's not a robust system. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think the question, and the truth is that Dave and I have been arguing about this for decades. Literally, is do we have a future in space? Is our future in space robotic? Is it space science, or does it involve human beings actually going there? And I mean, Dave has said all along. Well, what do you think? I mean, I think
yes, we have a future, and yes, it's robotic. I think that we've come up against we're, in the immortal words of Ned Beatty in Network, we're messing with the powerful forces of nature here. That
we've been doing that for a million years.
We cannot go fast enough. We cannot go far enough. But we have this tremendous capacity to create these eyes and ears that can go to these places for us. I hope, if you haven't seen this, I hope you all go home and Google two things: Joel's article from this weekend, and then the
Mission Improbable at
WashingtonPost.com. And then the astonishingly beautiful picture, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, that NASA released, was it 2 weeks ago, from the probe that is behind Venus now, that has captured a picture of the Earth offset by the profile of Venus and the rings. It was spectacular, vastly more moving and powerful and poetic than anything from the subsequent Apollo missions after the first one, and much better than the Winnebago in space, which is what I call the International Space Station. So why aren't we pouring all this money and effort and attention into these things? Because they are the extensions of us, and we can't go there.
Have you ever been in a Winnebago?
Yes.
I mean, I think those things are pretty cool. I mean, the space station, though it has been derided by certain cynics over time, the space station has, I think, over time won people over, in part because they built it, and it's up there, and it seems to work. It is this big laboratory that's going around the Earth. And if you saw, as actually Dave pointed this out to me, the great David Bowie song that was covered by astronaut Chris Hadfield a few months ago.
Third thing to Google.
It's really worth seeing.
I sent it to Joel with a note that said the best thing NASA's done since Apollo 11.
Yeah, it's really a wonderful video that Chris Hadfield did. I'm Mr. Science and all in favor of robotics. I do believe that the human presence adds an extra layer to these programs, and I also think, from a pragmatic standpoint, that sort of drives a lot of the interest in the agency and the funding for NASA. So if NASA just had a robotics program, I think it would be a much smaller agency. Yeah, I mean, you could argue it around or square it. In fact, are we going to take questions? I mean, how do
yes, we will eventually take questions.
I don't have I'm writing about this. I don't have a strong opinion about what they should do, but I would not dismiss the importance of the fact that right now Americans and Russians together are up on the space station, or the fact that Canadian Chris Hadfield, when he was up on the station, and they had to do an emergency repair of something that was broken. It was a leaking ammonia coolant was leaking out of the space station. They had to very quickly put together an emergency spacewalking mission, and it helped that Chris was fluent in Russian, and he and his Russian partner could help work to get these two spacewalkers out the door. I mean, it is a potential arena for human cooperation among nations that otherwise are not always getting along real well. I think that I wouldn't completely...
How far away is the space station from us when it passes right overhead?
I can't speak for Kansas City, but from Washington, D.C., it's about 250 miles up.
250
Here in the mountains,
miles.
It's different, you know.
250 miles. See, I believe that most Americans would guess that it's farther away than, say, Tulsa.
Okay, true. It's by distance, it's not a long way. But guess what? It's in space, okay? Okay, so there's no air. Okay, it is a completely different environment. Also, it's going around the Earth, every 90 minutes. What did you do today?
What, other than the human aspiration that was satisfied by, or that aspect of Apollo was so important and imprinted even cynical me to a much smaller extent. What was the scientific value of that? That's the epitome of successful human space exploration. What 40 years later, what is the bottom line on science out of Apollo?
I think that if you measure it purely in terms of science, the yield was not as great as if you measure it in terms of engineering. And I think that we shouldn't dismiss engineering and the management that goes into it. How are we going to actually pull this off? How are we going to come up with the systems of procuring the hardware? Making all this stuff work in terms of communications. I mean, I think that Apollo probably played an important role in the technological evolution of our whole civilization. Above and beyond, things like, Velcro and Teflon and things like that, simply to be able to pull off a very complex mission like that, lessons are learned. And I think that can I get profound for just a second?
You can try.
So I'll judge. I think that what we're witnessing is the planet becoming much more of an engineered planet, and that means that it's someday every blade of grass could have its own barcode. I don't know. The point is that we're going to have to figure out how are 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 billion people going to live here, and that is a management problem. It's an engineering problem. I mean, I'm all in favor of back to nature and let's go live in the woods like Thoreau. But how are we going to feed everyone? How are we going to give them water? How are we going to keep from polluting our planet? How are we going to keep the atmosphere from becoming too choked with carbon dioxide and methane and having runaway climate change? These are all really complex problems that are going to require solutions that include, among other things, engineering and management on a global scale, and almost certainly involve technology to some degree. So how are you going to do that? Well, the space program, although it's true, you can say, well, why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? I think if you develop skills at solving hard problems, they can be applied potentially to the hardest problems of all, which is how are we going to save the Earth and keep ourselves from ruining this beautiful planet? And the final point, which I know you agree with, thank you, the final point is that I think one thing that the space program tells us is that in the near term, and probably in the middle term, this is where we're going to live. We're not going to live on Mars. We're not going to live in space colonies. We're not going to live on the moon. We're not going to live, on some moon orbiting Saturn or Jupiter. We're here. And we're not going to have a second chance. And that's one thing we've learned, even as we've encountered these obstacles of trying to figure out what to do next after going to the moon. And we had the space shuttle, we had the space station. Now we have, struggling to figure out how to go, where else to go. I think one of the lessons is, okay, make sure that you keep Spaceship Earth running well. So.
I think you succeeded in profound. Now you work at the Washington Post, which has been in the news itself in the past 10 days. The company, after being owned for 80 years by the Meyer-Graham family, has been sold to a space entrepreneur of all people, Jeffrey Bezos, founder of Amazon, chairman of Amazon.com. He is now facing, I think, two challenging missions. He's trying to do private sector space exploration. I'd like to hear you rate his chances at that, but he's also trying to bail out a metropolitan newspaper, which may be harder. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so if he can put a man on the moon, could he possibly save the Washington Post? That's sort of what you're asking.
Yes, exactly.
His company's called Blue Origins, and I actually don't know much about it, so I'm not going to really speak to it other than it wants to do some kind of private venture involving suborbital flights and then orbital flights into space. But I'm going to do some further reporting on that, and I'd love to talk to Bezos about what he wants to do in space. Richard Branson is another entrepreneur who's interested in space tourism. Robert Bigelow in Las Vegas. Probably the most prominent is Elon Musk, who runs SpaceX, and he also is the owner of Tesla, the electric car company. And Elon is very much a believer in going to Mars someday. And it may be that the first human mission to Mars will be from the private sector, maybe with some public involvement, maybe a public-private partnership. But there's a lot of energy.
You reported that Elon Musk, which I had not heard, he wants to go himself.
He wants to go himself to
and
Mars.
Preferably to have that be his last adventure. He's not worried about coming back, in other words.
He doesn't worry about coming back. He would be happy to end his life on Mars.
Which I think if he goes, he stands a very good chance.
Yeah, it's a good chance, yes. And to his credit, he understands that, which is why he hasn't climbed into a rocket ship yet. So the question is, in a way, is how real are these entrepreneurial space ventures? And it's a little too soon to say. That's going to be one of the stories I do in the coming weeks, is try to report that out, so I can make an assessment of that. To the question of the Post. As you know, we are all at the Post quite shocked and rattled by this change in ownership. Also hopeful. I think that there's a lot of affection for the Graham family. There's a lot of security that has come from knowing that the Graham family owned the paper, because because among other things, Don Graham, the chairman of the board of the Washington Post company, worked at the newspaper. This is someone who was, he was to the manor born. His mother, Catherine Graham, owned the paper. But Don went off to Vietnam. He came back. He was a DC cop. He worked in the production room, and he was a sports editor. He worked on the city desk. I mean, he worked his way up through the building, worked in lots of different departments, and really got to know the business. And so he's someone who knows the name of everyone in the building, no matter what your job is. The new owner, we really don't know much about him. What does he want to do? We don't know. Where's this going to go? What's going to happen to the Washington Post? We don't know. So there's a lot of trepidation and there's a lot of anxiety about that. But I also think there's a lot of optimism too. I mean, that's a word you hear a lot in the newsroom. We're optimistic that this actually could be good because we've seen already hundreds of our colleagues walk out the door with buyouts in recent years and with some limited downsizing. The paper is smaller, circulation is smaller, the newsroom is smaller. The newsroom is also very different. So Dave and I are old school. You know, we report stories, we write stories. A lot of people now, they work in video or they work online only with various kinds of digital journalism.
Describe very briefly, because this fascinated me, your big project that ran this weekend. You had what were called production meetings, which I don't remember from my newspaper days. And the cast of characters was how many ink-stained wretches at typewriters? One, right? You?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of people in the room who were involved in elements of the business that are new, such as reader engagement. How do you increase the number of comments from readers? We actually, with our article, we pose questions and ask people to post an answer. There's the online template is very sophisticated. There's a motion graphic. So in the old days, the newspaper, you had a little graphic, okay, diagrams how the mission works. Now you go online, the graphic is a movie. It's a little movie you click on and stuff happens. There's a narrator, right? So and all these people are in the room. And so yeah, it's a different experience for me because there's so many moving parts now to a newspaper story like this. So where is this going to go? 10 years from now, will there still be a print edition? I hope so. I like print newspapers. But you could imagine the contrary. You could imagine that maybe the print edition would go away at some point. It depends on how people consume their news. If young people don't read print newspapers, at some point, they, by definition, will go away because you cannot sell people something they don't want. You just can't. That's not a business plan. So you got to meet the market where it is. You got to meet the readers where they are. And hopefully Jeff Bezos has some ideas for that. Amazon has been wildly successful, even through some hard times when people doubted that it could do what Bezos set out to do. So there's a lot of optimism in that. I mean, I will say this, that as far as I'm concerned, there are certain core values. You have to get it right. You have to be fair. You have to be interesting. You have to be professional. You have to be, courteous but also courageous when you do journalism. You have to tell people things they don't know, and do it in a way that shows a certain amount of craft and flair. You don't just spurt out everything that you think. You don't put everything into the paper. You're a filter. You say, you know what, that's not worthy of the Washington Post imprimatur. We're not going to put that in the paper because we're not sure it's true. We're not sure it's important. We're not sure it's decent. We're not going to put that. Okay, that if it says the Washington Post, it's supposed to have a special level of credibility, and that's maybe that's old school of me, but I hope that value system persists.
Well, if he does customer engagement, that will be a change for the newspaper business. When I was briefly in management at the Post, they used to send us out to focus groups to listen to our subscribers or former subscribers talk about the paper and what they liked about it or didn't like about it. And we would sit behind a one-way mirror and they would say things like, the stories are too long. I feel guilty because I get all this and most of it I don't read and I have to throw away. It piles up. It makes me feel bad, and they'd say, could I just buy the section that I like? And we'd say, no, of course you can't. You have to get it the way we want it. And, we'd drive back, and in the carpool, it'd be like, can you believe the crazy stuff they were saying?
Well,
they want shorter stories. Let's get back to work on our 7-part, 27-page series.
When I was a very, I will tell you something that's going to horrify you. When I was a very young reporter, I had this column. I got lots of letters with questions from people. It was a question and answer column, and I was overwhelmed by the mail, and I couldn't possibly answer it all. So I had a stamp made, like an ink stamp, and it said, because I get so much mail, I can't normally answer letters personally, but yours was so special, I wanted to write back and say thank you. And I'd stamp it. Sometimes I stamp it twice to make clear. Anyway, but back then we weren't really worried about we were making money. It was terrible. But anyway.
I'm glad you came to Kansas City. I'm glad you all came out tonight to meet my friend. And thank you very much, Crosby, for having us.
Thank you, Crosby. Okay.